Washington Journal continues.
Michael Sargent joins us. He's from the Heritage Foundation. He's a policy analyst that, and other things, takes a look at transportation issues. And we thank you for joining us for our Your Money segment.
Pedro, thanks for having me.
The Federal Aviation Administration overall is what we'll talk about. Can we start, though, from last week? We had one death occur because of an airline incident. What's the larger issues the FAA does when it comes to airline safety?
Sure. So I think that's probably the most important function that the FAA has. It is first and foremost the civilian aviation safety regulator. And among other things, it regulates virtually every single step of the process when it comes to aviation, when it comes to aircraft manufacturing, flight standards, and then even some of the business practices that airlines undertake. So the FAA has a very wide scope when it comes to regulatory authority, but then also it operates the air traffic control system, and that is the backbone of our aviation system. Day to day, federal employees are operating the very movements of the aircraft. So the FAA is incredibly heavily involved when it comes to safety, and that's the foremost part of their mission. And so one of the things that we're going to see in this authorization coming up in Congress is how they're going to address safety, because some of the procedures have been repeatedly referenced as inefficient, overlapping, and there are some problems that have arisen there, and that's one of the things I think they're going to tackle in this authorization.
What are some of those procedures that you would deem overlapping or redundant?
So the FAA has a bunch of regional offices all over the country that are in charge of enforcing the regulatory aspects of the FAA, and the GAO and the Inspector General have looked at some of these processes, and they're not as well coordinated as they could be. Some are more timely than others, and so they're looking to essentially, in this authorization that we're going to discuss, have an advisory committee from everyone in industry to members of Congress to aviation experts come together and basically say, how can we make this system work better, work more efficiently, allow manufacturers to get their products to market quicker, while increasing the safety aspects of the regulations.
So our guests will continue on with the topic of the Federal Aviation Administration and airline safety. If you want to ask them questions about those aspects, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. When it comes to actual aircraft safety, does the FAA mandate inspection times, tolerances for the engines? Are they that nuanced and that detailed?
Absolutely, and that's one of the issues that we're examining, is that are these regulations, are they too prescriptive? Because sometimes industry has better ways to meet the overall objective of safety. And of course, when it comes to safety, I think the airlines themselves and manufacturers have a much greater incentive than necessarily bureaucrats in making sure that their aircrafts and their operations are safe, because it's generally not a very good business model to kill your passengers and your employees. So I think they have a great incentive, but what the FAA also does is making sure that that is well coordinated across various parts. And again, when you look at the reports from the Inspector General and the GAO, this is one thing that could be improved, and that's what they're going to be debating.
So are you suggesting that policing themselves would do them better in the long run?
To some extent, but also just making sure that industry has flexibility rather than the FAA mandating one certain way of doing any general process. The industry might say, well, we have these 3 ways of doing it. Why don't we test out and see which one works best, not only for safety, but then also for efficiency?
In a general sense, how much does the FAA cost the federal government and by virtue the taxpayer?
Its budget's around $17 billion every year. Most of that goes to air traffic control operations. Then they also are in charge of funding airports and regulating airports. That's kind of the other big part. So it's basically threefold. You have air traffic control operations, safety regulations, and airport funding.
And so with those big 3 parts, where does TSA fall in?
TSA is not part of the FAA. TSA is part of the Department of Homeland Security.
And so then for those other aspects, then you said it was $17 billion?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about then efficiency. What, as far as the money that gets spent, how does the FAA use that, and is it being used in an efficient manner?
Well, the biggest, like I said, the biggest portion of that goes to air traffic control operations. And that has been a source of debate over the last 2 years. Chairman Bill Schuster of the House T&I Committee had a proposal that would essentially move the air traffic control operations out of the FAA and establish it in a nonprofit private sector entity that is governed by a board of stakeholders. And what we've seen is that other countries that have done this have generally experienced greater efficiency with flyer dollars, because those are the people who are on the hook for it. When you buy an airplane ticket, generally 14% of that goes to the government through various taxes and fees. And so his proposal was modeled off of Canada's. Nav Canada, and what we've seen since they've done this in the 1990s is a reduction in user fees by 40%. So that is a debate that had taken place over the last 2 years when it comes to the efficiency of the largest part of the FAA. But unfortunately, the chairman was forced to pull that proposal earlier this year because of a lack of support in Congress, generally due to various special interest groups that were lobbying against it.
Expand on that.
The proposal had basically two main sources of opposition. One from Democrats who just wanted to oppose something that President Trump ostensibly supported, or had problems with any sort of privatization narrative in general, although the bill did have bipartisan support. Then there was a group of Republicans who, generally from rural states, that had general aviation interests in their district, be that manufacturers or business airlines. And right now, under the current system, business jets and their ilk pay very little into the system through taxes and fees compared to what commercial taxpayers are paying. So essentially, the current system is a cross-subsidy from you and me when we fly commercial to the private jets who use the air traffic control system. And they were worried that moving into this new system, even though the law would have explicitly banned new fees on general aviation, they're worried that sometime in the future they might have to start paying into the system. So basically they're getting a sweetheart deal and didn't want to lose it.
202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents, 202-748-8002. If you want to make your thoughts known on Twitter, you could do so at C-SPAN WJ. You can also post on our Facebook page at facebook.com/CSPAN. Michael Sargent, when it comes to the president's desire to see this this next gen approach, or more of a free market approach, how much support did he have for that personally?
Well, it was in his first two budgets, and then he made an announcement at the White House sometime last year voicing his support for ATC reform broadly. But then it came out apparently in this kind of negotiation process in the House when they're trying to wrangle the votes to pass the bill, that the White House, they weren't lending as much support when it came to actually getting the votes together as was apparent in their budget. And that was one of the reasons that Chairman Schuster cited in his pulling this piece from the FAA reauthorization. And so now that's on the sidelines, and it's not quite clear what exactly the administration is looking for in this authorization, but I think we'll see them start weighing in as the debate begins.
When it comes to authorization as a whole, talk about what you expect out of the debate, and is this going to be a smooth kind of process?
Well, like I said, the air traffic control reform portion is now out of the bill, and that was far and away the most controversial aspect of it. And so I would expect that it will be able to move along in a more smooth process now, but it's still not entirely clear what exactly the Senate is going to do in regards to the House bill. And also, when the House bill was dropped, there are already 225 amendments that have been dropped to an already 350-page bill. So there's a lot in there. It is missing kind of the bigger reform aspects, as I mentioned, ATC. Then also it avoided a fairly controversial issue about airport funding. And so those are generally the two big pieces that garner the most controversy. But there are plenty of smaller things in there. Last year, the Senate bill only had one provision about pilot certification requirements, the number of hours that they needed, what counted toward those hours. And even something that nuanced was enough to generate controversy and kind of hold up the process. So we never really know, but I would expect now that the most controversial aspects are out, that the debate can at least move farther along this time.
We'll take some calls. Our first one is from Cindy. She's in Minnesota, Republican line. You're on with Michael Sargent of Heritage Foundation. Go ahead.
Good morning. It's really sad what's happened to the airline, the aviation industry. When I got married, my husband was, he's an aircraft inspector, he was. And all our income went towards, that career, because it was a very critical career. But then during, I forget, was the President Bush, there was a series of chopping and restructuring some of the big airlines, and what they did to the industry was deplorable. I mean, it was horrible. And we need to do something, because doing nothing isn't anything good for the consumers or anyone else. But I don't know, it seems like the Democrats are constantly no, no, no to everything. And I'm concerned, too, with Mr. Macron coming in. These globalist ideas are not for the people.
Okay, we'll keep it there only because we're going to keep to the topic at hand. Mr. Sargent.
Absolutely. There are certain things that customers find objectionable to the airline industry, but I would say that since deregulation took place in the late 1970s, we have seen a drastic reduction in fares. So it is easier than ever for consumers to get on the flight. And I think that if we want to increase choice and competition, there are ways we can do that through federal policy. There are certain things about the way we fund airports that tend to favor entrenched airlines and limit competition. That is one thing we should look at to improve competition. Then also other protections that the airlines have, like ownership requirements and other kind of protectionist areas that the airlines benefit from. And that's something I think going forward we need to look at if we want more competition and choice in the airline industry. I'm not sure we're going to get that from this authorization. Again, that's very controversial, but we'll see going forward.
From Pennsylvania, Republican line, Andy is next.
Hello, thank you very much. I'll try to be quick with my question. As far as the FAA goes, and your remark that the majority of their budget is for air traffic control operations, I'm wondering, are they ever going to look into a system like self-driving cars? In other words, a system that's automated for air traffic control, and get rid of a large number of these controllers and thus cut the budget back and not have to worry about things like human error? Thank you, sir.
So there is experimental research going on in regards to this sort of thing, advanced technologies for air traffic control. There's something called free flight, which is basically autonomous planes, and already great portions of flying is already automated. And then when it comes to air traffic control, what we're seeing is companies like Google and Amazon are actually experimenting with their own systems for low altitude airspace for drone operations. So there is a lot of innovation or potential innovation in this area, but it is currently very experimental. I think right now we need to focus on restructuring air traffic control in a way that can benefit flyers today rather than 10 or 20 years down the line.
Is there resistance from those who represent air traffic controllers to that idea?
So when it came to Chairman Schuster's proposal to restructure the FAA, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, NATCO, was actually on board with that. So it was a, I would say, kind of rare meeting of the minds between small government conservatives and a labor union. So that was actually one of the big, I think, support bases for that authorization. But in the end, again, Chairman Schuster had to pull that.
Ohio is next. That's where Linda is on our independent line. Go ahead, you're next.
Yes, I work for an airline company that made these blades that's in these engines for 42 years, and I'm retired now 10 years, but 12 years before I retired, our companies, which I worked for PCC Aerofoils, which they built plants in Mexico. They said we make too much money. We was a union plant, but we had to be really good at inspecting. I inspected for 42 years, and we had to be really precise with what we did. And we found out when this stuff moved, they just moved things through. And I don't understand why, if you're worried about safety, why aren't they making these people inspect stuff like we had to do? We took classes and everything. Thank you very much for taking my call.
Well, I would just say on safety, again, aviation is the safest mode of travel. This unfortunate fatality we just saw from Southwest 1380 was the first fatality since 2009. And so when you're moving, coming up on 1 billion passengers every single year and have such a low fatality rate, I think we're doing something right. And we need to continue down this path and continue reviewing the processes. But I would argue that safety right now should not necessarily be the focus when it comes to cracking down on the industry. And compared to other modes of travel, I mean, we have nearly 40,000 people die a year from traffic injuries and accidents, compared to just right now 1 for aviation. I would say that we need to continue to innovate in that area when it comes to traffic rather than looking at the airlines, which right now are overwhelmingly the safest way to get around.
202-748-8001 for Republicans, and Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002. The National Transportation Safety Board tells us that it was in 2009 that Colgan Air crash causing 45 fatalities. 2006 was before that with 47 fatalities for Comair. Then it goes back to 2004 with 11 fatalities. With that in mind, would you suggest that there's no interest then amongst current legislators to improve those safety aspects as part of this authorization?
Well, like I said, they are looking at certification reforms and ways that, again, the industry can look at more innovative methods rather than kind of focusing on prescriptive regulations from the FAA. But I don't think there's a tremendous amount of interest in more burdensome regulation when it comes to safety. And I think that's hands down the right approach. Again, we've seen just such a great success when it comes to the airline industry and the safety of their operations. And I mean, compared to 40 years ago, even when flying was relatively safe back then, it is hands down safer now. So I think we need to keep doing what we're doing, and kind of reversing that by going back and trying to re-regulate a lot of the airlines would absolutely be the wrong way to go.
When it comes, sorry, go ahead.
And could have unintended consequences down the road.
When it goes to the funding of airports, then, in a general sense, what does the federal government make what are they responsible for?
So we spend about $3.5 billion per year federal funding for airports. And the problem with that is that it is kind of a classic middleman system where flyers pay taxes into the system, the federal government gets it, Congress kind of puts in its pet projects and sends it back out to airports. And the problem we see is that the vast majority of dollars goes to airports that relatively few flyers use. So the 60 largest airports in the U.S. carry about 88% of the traffic, but they only get about a quarter of federal airport funding. So the sad reality is that most flyers are paying, in effect, for airports that they will never use. And what we're seeing is that our largest airports, they're the ones with the greatest capital needs, and they're the ones that need to expand to be able to serve more flyers in the future, as we're expecting within the next couple of years, 1 billion airline passengers. And in addition to that inequity in funding, the federal government also imposes incredibly heavy-handed regulations on airports. And so we have a unique airport funding system where airports are not really allowed to charge their customers, the flyers, for most of their services. Instead, they have to go to the airlines. And the airlines have their own interests at heart. They generally like to maintain their market share for any given airport. So they do a lot to kind of cut out new entrants into the market. And that's one of the things I discuss when it comes to airport and airline competition. If we reform the way we fund airports, we might be able to get a lot more choice for consumers and add to the capital needs for the airports themselves.
How do we end up with a formula where a large amount of the money goes to the smaller airport?
That was decided by Congress, and so they tend to be the airports that are not as self-sustaining as the larger ones. They tend to be in fairly rural areas, generally isolated, and I think that was just kind of a compromise that they had made. And again, this was solely because most passengers are paying directly into the system. They don't really, it's not transparent at all. We don't really know what they're paying. And then the rural areas have a fairly strong constituency in the House and also the Senate, so they were able to get those concessions.
Let's hear from Peter. He's in Connecticut, Republican line.
He mentioned the private jet industry having a sweetheart deal, and I was just wondering if they cater to the 1% and mostly business. Just a question. Thank you.
Yeah, so right now, like I mentioned, for air traffic control operations, flyers pay in mostly through a ticket tax, some other fees. But when you actually look at who uses the airspace, private jets and other general aviation aircraft take up about 10% of operation, 1% towards the Airway and Airport Trust Fund. And so that is a massive inequity, and that shortfall is funded by commercial flyers, who are the main funders of the system. And again, they're the ones who are opposed to any air traffic control changes because they're worried that in the future they might actually have to pay their fair share when it comes to the price of air traffic control. On our independent line from Post Falls, Idaho, Tom, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'd just like to say that the FAA is really one of the few government agencies that I think works for the American people. So I'm grateful for them keeping us safe. My family flies overseas to Israel every single year from the West Coast, and I really don't have to worry about it. I would like to know if the TSA money has anything to do with the FAA budget, or is that completely separate? And please address that. Have a good day. Thanks.
So yes, the TSA budget is separate as part of the Department of Homeland Security. But on that, what we've actually seen is the fees that get paid to TSA, their user fees, end up going to other parts of the budget because Congress kind of treats them like a cash cow. Whenever they need money to pay for a different piece of spending legislation, they'll often look to TSA user fees as a means to offset other spending. And that's a huge problem, and I think the American people deserve better than having their security fees going to complete separate spending legislation.
So his assessment that the FAA is one of those areas that works?
I generally agree with that. I think their role as a safety regulator has been a great success. Like I've repeatedly said, the aviation industry is incredibly safe now. Air traffic controllers do a very good job, but again, they're kind of structurally inhibited within their confines of the FAA. Moving them out, I think, would be a better system, and that's what most everywhere else in the developed world has done, at least separating air traffic control operations from the civilian aviation safety regulator, because right now having them in the same entity creates a little bit of a conflict of interest because you're essentially, the FAA regulates itself. You want to have an arm's length regulatory structure to ensure real accountability and transparency, because right now, if the FAA is going to Congress trying to justify higher spending, they're not necessarily going to point out all the things they're doing wrong.
It was earlier this year and before the incident of last week, obviously, that President Trump sent out a tweet taking a look at airline safety overall, and here's what it says. It said, since taking office, I've been very strict on commercial aviation. Good news, it was just reported there was 0 deaths in 2017, the best and safest year on record. That last part aside, let's start on the first part, very strict on general aviation. Does that pass muster?
I'm not entirely sure what the president was referring to in that tweet. I think, again, we've seen the FAA been a key player when it comes to safety regulations. There hasn't been a death up until this year since 2009. So I'm not sure exactly if there were any new regulations put into force. I think it generally refers to a more long-term trend that we've seen over the last half century or so.
So as far as the authorization process itself, walk us through the schedule. Where are we at the process, and what do you expect to happen?
Sure. So the bill was released last week by the House T&I Chairman Bill Schuster. It still has to go through committee markup and then as well 200 plus amendments on the floor in the House. So they're going to have to go through a good chunk of those. Some of them won't be ruled in order. So they're expecting a vote on the House floor sometime this week. Then it's not entirely clear where the Senate is in this process. Again, there was a controversial provision in their bill last year regarding pilots and their certification. And so they're still, I think, hashing that out. And then what their bill is going to look like is anybody's guess, and I doubt it would be solely based on the House's bill. And so then they're going to have to hash that out. If it's able to pass both the House and the Senate, they're going to have to come to conference and pass something. And the deadline for reauthorization is the end of September, which, given that the amount of time Congress is in recess, that's really not all that much time to get this all sorted out. So they might have to do another short-term extension, but the House is moving pretty briskly at this point.
Michael Sargent covers transportation issues for the Heritage Foundation, serves as a policy analyst for that organization. Heritage.org is the website if you want to check out his work on this space. Mr. Sargent, thanks for joining us.
Pedro, thanks for having me.
We